I'm going to start with one turn below the bridge, much like I did with the Schwabisch Prusik. But whereas a Prusik configuration, I will change directions once I come above the bridge. Now when I come above the bridge, I'm going to travel in the same direction, much like we do with our taut line hitch. And again here, I'll take 4 turns above the bridge. And really, with both the Schwabisch and the Diestel, the amount of turns above the bridge has to do somewhat with the length of our split tail. For myself, I like a 4/1. Now notice here, I've really fashioned something of a taut line hitch. The line enters from one end and exits the other. Note here the bar on the diagonal. But unlike the taut line hitch, I don't want to sit down into this. What I want to do is, I'm going to attach both ends back to the carabiner. This way, I won't have any of that rolling effect. In fact, I can also utilize the micro pulley, much as I did with the Schwabisch Prusik. But see here, because I'm loading both parts of the line, I won't have the rolling. And again, the Diestel, it loads nicely, it grabs readily, and much like the Schwabisch Prusik, I can break the knot easily with just 2 fingers after I've loaded it. And again, even though it's been loaded hard, I can tend the slack very nicely with my micro pulley. So this is kind of interesting because this really seems to be a variation of the taut line hitch, yet it has some much more favorable characteristics. Again, some characteristics that we'd really like in a climbing hitch. It grabs readily, yet it breaks easily. Here, this doesn't roll out. So both the Schwabisch Prusik and the Diestel are 2 good examples of some of the newer climbing hitches that are being used today. And again, they're gaining more and more popularity.
One last group of climbing hitches we'd like to talk about are the French Prusik hitches. There are a lot of variations in this knot, but one common way to tie it is by taking one short I&I piece, and this configuration is actually a val détente truss, or VT. Now what I will do is wrap upwards. I'll take 4 turns, and now I will crisscross or braid down 3 times and clip into the eyes. Now, in the same way that Rip showed the Schwabisch Prusik and the Diestel, I can clip in with a micro pulley and a pear-shaped carabiner, tie, dress, and set. Now it's obviously important to make sure this is dressed properly. This can be a bit of a temperamental knot. I want to make sure that I have it dressed. Now I mentioned there are some different variations on the French Prusik. Ken is tied in with an endless loop and done 4 wraps up top and 3 crosses down. Now tied in an endless loop, this will be referred to as the Machade truss, or MT.
This is actually the first way that I saw the French Prusik family of climbing hitches used by a Belgian fella, Francois Dussen. And we learned by experimentation that it really did have some limitations. Now those limitations had much to do with the knowledge and the expertise and the experience of the user. There are variations, and there are different lines in a specific length that needs to be used. It's kind of a temperamental climbing hitch. We actually use it in rigging where we can add as many turns and as many crosses as we want, so we can grab a hold of that rope very firmly and not have any concern about it sliding. Whereas both of these used in a climbing application, we're trying to walk that very fine line where we have just enough friction to hold us, yet when we go to release, it goes for us, okay? And these 2 hitches, I know, when you do release them, they really do release completely. They're a bit more like a splice in a way, I find, in the sense that the friction is spread out over a greater area, yet when they're collapsed, they open right up and release the climbing line, and you go. So it's one that needs to be used very carefully And because there are so many nuances and different methods of tying the French pressix and different combinations, we really need to look closely at limitations. For example, I mentioned the length of the loop, or here in your case, the I&I pressix, also the diameter, and the softness or suppleness versus stiffness in a more static rope, for example, will make a difference in its ability to grab and hold on the rope. You really have to pay attention to many different features and when you're going to be understanding the nuances of how to use either one of these hitches in a climbing situation.
Well, Ken, that was good. Isn't it nice, the wide choice of different knots we have these days when putting together our climbing system?
It gives us options. We can build the system that we want to use to climb with a number of different choices. We need to be doing so safely, whether we're choosing a termination knot, we need to tie it properly for attaching the rope to a connecting link, for example. When we tie, dress, and set our climbing hitch, we need to be doing so in the right way, and that means that we're looking for, and our goal is to accomplish, working safer, easier, and more efficient.
That's right. Let's work smarter, not harder.
Absolutely. Well, this is Ken Palmer
And Rip Tompkins
with Arbor Master Training,
reminding you please to climb safe, cut safe, and rig right.
and we'll see you at the top.
Hey Ken, looks like you've used a slipped sheet bend there to send that rigging line up into the tree.
That's right, Rip. This is a good choice for this particular application, but in rigging applications, rigging operations in general, there are many different knots, hitches, and bends that we may choose to use in any given situation. It's important that we understand the right knot to choose for any particular situation. You might say the best knot for any given situation, but that depends on the ropes that we're using and the particular application. We need to consider bend radius. That may lead to undue strength loss to the entire system that we're building. And we need to consider the ease of tying, and then even the ease of untying afterwards.
Absolutely. And of course, it's always essential that when we are tying a knot, that we tie it correctly, dress it or align all the parts, and then set it before we put it into use. That's a process we refer to as TDS.
That's right. I think we should take a good look at a number of the more common and very useful knots used in rigging operations.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
All right. Before we start tying knots, I want to encourage you to use the manual that we've created to go along with the video. Now, there are many nuances and there are many usages of the knots we'll be looking at. We'll be looking at limitations and some of the uses, but again, I want to encourage you to use the manual because there's a lot of supplemental information. It'll be very useful to you as you go to tie these knots for yourself. I'd like to introduce Sean Gear with Arbor Master Training. Sean, could I get you to begin by introducing the parts of the line? Why don't we start there?
No problem. Before we can actually discuss the various knots, we need to agree on some terminology for the parts of the line. I have the working end of the line, and this will be the part that we'll be using. We'll be tying knots with this. The opposite end, that part not in use, will be the running end. The standing part will be everything in between. It's helpful to understand a few terms so we can break knots down to their component parts. We can have a bight in the line, and this will be an uncrossed section of the rope. We can have a loop in the line, and this will be a crossed bight. If we have a loop around an object, that would be a turn. Now we have two loops around an object, that would be a round turn. Now a knot is a general term. I'd like to introduce a couple more specific terms that are a little more descriptive. Now a hitch would be using the working end of the rope and affixing it either to an object, such as in a clove hitch, or to the standing part of the line, as in a taut line hitch. Now a bend could be used to affix two separate lines, such as in a Zeppelin bend, or the opposite ends of one rope, such as in a double fisherman's bend. Now let's see if we can employ some of these knot terms and tie a simple bowline. I'll make a counterclockwise loop in the standing part of the rope. I'll take the working end and pass it up through the loop, around the standing part of the rope, and back down into the loop, making sure that my working end is inside of the loop. Now I tie the knot, I'll dress it or align the parts so they're in their proper place, and I'll set the knot or tighten it. Now you can see I've created a bite within a loop, and that's how we can break knots down into their component parts.
For butt hitching wood down on the central lead, you can see here that I've set my sling with the block and the rigging line in it. Then I cut my face notch and I made my curve cuts. Notice I've got a slip knot here in my rigging line. That will keep the rigging line from running away from me through the block and back down to the ground again. Now, I've left a fair amount of rope here. That's going to give me enough rigging line to work with without it being pulled back through the block again. I'm forming a half hitch on the stem, and then I'll follow it with a running bowline. I start with a running bowline by taking the working end and coming around the standing part of the rigging line. Then I will take the working end and place it where I want the loop to be as I start to form my bowline. I flip over and back around the standing part and back through the loop, tie, dress, and set the running bowline, and then I'll move my half hitch into position. I'll remove my slip knot and tension it up. So I have a half hitch and a running bowline, and the two will share the load as the load comes to bear in the rigging line. Let's look at another method of tying off the piece that I'm about to cut. This is a London plane, and they do tend to be a bit slippery, especially if it's wet. Now I do have a branch collar here, and as you can see, that's helping hold the bowline in place. If I didn't have that, then the running bowline may want to slide down on me. It might even make it more difficult to tie. I have a couple of other choices. Before I untie, I want to put a slip knot back in the rope. I'll need a little bit more rigging line here. This time I'll form a marlin hitch. I'll come over and through, and you may recognize this as an overhand knot around the stem. It's actually known as a marlin hitch. Now I'll tie my clove hitch. I pass around the stem, forming a loop, passing under, around again, and under. I actually have a clove hitch here. Now in this application, I'll have to back it up with not only one better half, but two. Tie, dress, and set. One half hitch, two half hitches. And my marl, I want to make sure that the line is lined up right in front of my notch. The block is also in front of my notch. Then I remove my slip knot. Notice that my rigging line and my block are lined up right in front of my face notch. And as I make my turns around the stem to tie it off, I always turn around the stem in the same direction. That ensures that the knots work together properly. If I start changing direction with my turns, they can work to loosen each other. So be sure to turn in the same direction around the stem. Okay, we're ready to proceed.
One of the simplest and most versatile knots in rigging would be the common slip knot. Now, I'll start the slip knot by making a loop and passing a bite through the loop. Now that's a directional slip knot in that loaded this way, it will bind, but if it happens to be loaded from this way, it will slip out. Now, one way I like to use this directional slip knot is during a lowering operation. If we have a block set in a tree and I want to pull the rope up, I can estimate how far below the block the climber is. At this point, they're about 10 feet below, so I can measure out 5, and feet and tie a directional slip knot by making a loop and passing a bite through it. As I mentioned, directional, so when it hits the block, it will not pull out. And now I can pull this up to the climber, and they'll be able to grab it, pull on the tail, and pull the slip knot out. I'd like to talk about a few attachment knots. Say I have a climber up in the tree and I need to send up a lowering line. Well, one bend that I could tie would be a sheet bend. Basically, I'll start with a bite in the climbing line, and I'll take the lowering line, come up through the bite, around the back, take my end and pass it between the line and the bite. I'll tie it, dress it, and set it. Now if you look closely at the sheet bend, it looks similar to a bowline. We have the bite within the loop. Now in this case it is a bend because we're attaching two ropes together. Now the climber will get this up in the tree, and what they need to do is pull on this end, and they're ready to put the line to work. Now, one variation on a sheet bend would be a slipped sheet bend or a slippery sheet bend. I can pass and start the knot in the same way, but instead of passing the end through, I'll take a bite and pass it in there. Now when the climber would get this in the tree, what they would need to do is pull on the end, and the line is free. Now, one more variation would be something called a slippery bend. I'd start in this